very clean. That should help with the flow. 259. All right, 3 o'clock. I'm going to hit broadcast. Ready, Charlie?
Okay, great. Good afternoon and welcome from Lakeside, Chautauqua. We're here this afternoon with Kim Langley, a certified grief counselor and spiritual director, and we're happy to have her here with us through the miracle of technology from home in Lakewood, Ohio. Before we get started, I want to remind you of some of the things that Religious Life has going on during this week at Lakeside. If you are on the grounds, I would invite you in the morning to be part of our Faith for Living with Reverend Dr. Myron McCoy from the pastor of Chicago Temple, who is with us talking about sheep, shepherding, and keeping on the path. And that will be tomorrow morning, Wednesday and Thursday from 9 until 10 a.m. And then Wednesday afternoon, again, will be our second session with Kim Langley. Here at this, wherever you pick this up on the 3 different formats from 3 until 4:30 p.m. And then I also want to remind you of our picnic on Wednesday night. It's $6 a plate per person, and it's in Perry Park and served by Ward Catering. Tomorrow evening will be Vespers at the Steel Memorial Bandstand from 7 to 7:30. With Dr. McCoy, and on Thursday with the Reverend Karen Graham, pastor of Lakeside United Methodist Church, also from 7 to 7:30, and communion will be served. Also, this summer we are offering the Faith Walk devotional book that has been put together by our Religious Life advisory team. It's 16 different places in Lakeside where you can go and read a Bible verse, and there's a meditation and some questions for reflection. And you can do that all in one day or in a variety of different days while you're here. And if you're not here but would like to have one of these, just write and ask for one. Contact us through our telephone at Lakeside 419-798-4461 and extension 214 for Religious Life, or you can email us at lakesideohio.com. Well, we're happy this afternoon to have Kim Langley with us. I shared with the folks this morning at Faith for Living that the church where I am serving, Kim came and did a seminar for us, and it was extremely helpful. I want to say that she is a certified spiritual director. She is President of LifeBalance Enterprises with 20 years of experience as a retreat leader and trainer. She founded Word Spa Ministries for the advancement of spirituality, poetry, and appreciation. She lives with her husband, Bill, in Lakewood, Ohio. And like I say, we're happy to have her with us. Kim has written a book, Send My Roots Rain. It is available in our fine print bookstore here in Lakeside or online through the bookstore, and they can help you order it. There's also ample copies available, and it's something that you're going to want to have in your personal library. At this point, I don't want to take up any more of her time. So Kim, welcome to Lakeside. And
thank you, Charlie.
Seminar, and we're happy to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start to share my screen. And I just want to say, while that's all coming up, that I've been to Lakeside many, many times, and it's a place of very happy memory for me. And I sure wish I was with you today. But I am glad to be with you in this way. And thank you for that gracious introduction, by the way, Charlie. I'm not a grief counselor, as in I'm not a licensed professional counselor. I have a pastoral counseling certification. My master's degree is in education. So I actually started my career 1,000 years ago as a high school theology teacher. And my husband also taught theology for many years and was a campus minister, a Newman campus minister. So I made my living as a speaker and trainer, and I have corporate and healthcare and not-for-profit clients. But I always kept my hand, I worked for churches for a while, and then I always kept my hand in retreat work, and I love it. And somehow this book came to me. It was actually approached, I've been doing poetry circles for years, And they're really a beautiful way to have a deep dive into significant conversation. I dare to call it a kind of group spiritual direction. But I was not looking to write this book. It came to me. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about, very little bit about where I'm coming from as a person who speaks with others about grief and who's written a book. And I welcome your questions and comments, and even your yeah buts, your disagreements, as long as they're framed respectfully. And you can put those in the chat box, and we have folks watching them so that they can let me know if something comes up, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So let's start by saying what a timely time this is to talk about grief. I saw a quote in the Washington Post that said, "What a year these pandemic months have been." Isn't that the truth? Holy moly. It seems like we've been trying to adjust to this pandemic lifestyle forever, and it's only been 100+ days since most of us had the old normal. So right now, in addition to any personal losses that you and I might be experiencing, there's so much loss in society as a whole, because almost everybody we know has lost a job, or their business is struggling, or they've had a death. Or I just talked to somebody yesterday who has 10 siblings and their parent died and people couldn't come to the funeral. So that's a loss on top of a loss. It's a lot. On the other hand, I like to remind myself that we've survived 100% of our worst days. I think you might want to make a sign and hang that up for yourself. So far, you've survived 100% of your worst days. And I feel confident that with the help of God, we'll survive this too. But this whole experience, both of personal loss and societal loss, is a very powerful lesson in impermanence. And I think it's one that's particularly challenging for Americans because we don't really like to be reminded of impermanence. Our cultural ethos is very built around, be strong, figure out the problem, solve it, control the outcomes, prepare for what could go wrong. And those are great things about our national character. And at the same time, we don't have a real strong part in our national character that says, appreciate it while you have it. Things can change in a moment. Not everything is under our control. Sometimes control is really an illusion. And some other cultures are more steeped in that mentality than we are. So we're getting a chance to learn that. I'm mindful of the Japanese culture, which of course has its own issues. Everyone does. But in my book, I wrote about the beautiful tradition of stopping everything for a day and going out to see the cherry blossoms when they first open. I mean, companies will rent a bus and take all their employees to a cherry grove, and people hang lanterns in the trees and have picnics. And it's a really powerful cultural moment of, this won't last long. It's ephemeral. We have to enjoy it and take it in while we have it. Soon these beautiful blossoms will be on the ground. So Robert Frost captured that, an American poet, for us in his poem, Nothing Gold Can Stay. It ends with, dawn goes down today, nothing gold can stay. So just like the cycle of sunrise and sunset happens every day, there are always going to be losses, large and small, in life. And I had 2 significant losses of my own, actually almost exactly 2 years ago. My dad went in for a routine hip surgery and had a massive stroke, and we had to put him right into hospice. There wasn't a thing they could do for him. And then about a month later, my mother had a massive stroke. I mean, what are the chances of that? So like everybody has, their own grief story. I think, it's significant that just a little bit about my story so that where I'm coming from. So Wednesday, we're going to talk more on the professional level. We're going to describe a little bit about how you can use poetry in ministry. And it turns out that poetry is really significant for people who are seekers, or people who, if you do chaplaincy work, for example, or pastoral care, these persons might be the ones that check the box that say none when you ask them what their religious preference is. I'm sorry, give me 1 second. I have to find a thing here that I just realized I wanted to pull up for you and I forgot. Oh yeah, no, that's not what I humbly apologize. You know, this is another lesson in humility, because you know how you think you have everything ready and then you realize you forgot something? That's what's happening to me right now. So often when I was younger, I would have been embarrassed. Now I just laugh at myself. And I encourage you to do the same. All right, I think this is what I want. Holy moly, Kim. You are hilarious. You can see my whole life unfolding here in front of you, right? There we go. That's what I want. Okay, so let's start from that slide. All right. So this was me on unboxing day when the books finally came. I was supposed to write it in a year. It took me 4 years. So that gives you a sense of, I hope, blessing your own grief struggle and how long it might take you to learn how to carry grief. Personally, I avoid terms like even healing grief sets some people off, but I definitely avoid terms like resolving grief or closure. I think closure, while very widely embraced when people first started to talk about it, has done us a great disservice, because more recent research, and I'll bet your experience as well as mine, makes closure not really the right fit for what happens with grief. I believe we navigate grief. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the tasks of mourning. And I believe we learn to carry grief. Anne Lamott has she's a spiritual writer. She's a clever saying that I can't quite come up with, but she says, learning to carry these difficulties is like learning to walk with a limp. You know, you walk again, but it's never exactly the same gait as it was before. So that you know where I'm coming from in the rest of my presentations, I want to start with this. Your loss is not a test. Your loss is not a lesson. Your loss is not a gift. Your loss is a loss. Now, here's what I mean by that. First and foremost, I believe we are called to do the work of grieving, to enter into the grief and just be with it. I hope for you and for me that I will learn lessons from my grief. I hope that my loss eventually could become a gift to others in the way, you know, I get to do workshops on this now, or the way I was able to finally release the book. I don't believe with any part of myself, and you may disagree, that loss is not a test. I think I mentioned to you that I started out as a theology teacher 1,000 years ago. And I saw early on that saying the wrong thing to someone who has just had a death in the family can turn them off to religion and God for the rest of their lives. So I had a student, her name was Amy, and she had a beloved grandmother who she was actually closer to than her parents. And her grandmother died when she was a junior in high school, and I was teaching her in class at that time. I'd have her several times. We were a small school. And she came in to me after school one day just sobbing because someone at the funeral home said to her something like, God needed another angel and only the good die young, and so on. And she was just sobbingly furious to think that God like gets up one morning and makes a decision. Okay, you, and you. She said, doesn't God know that I needed my grandmother, more than God did? And that's an example of somebody who's devastated by thoughtless comfort. And I don't mean ill-meant comfort. I've said thoughtless things myself. I'm ashamed to admit it, that as I know better, I do better. We probably all could admit to that. But I don't believe that God decides to test somebody by sending them an illness or taking away a loved one, that their life will never be the same without. I think loss is loss, and then we make of it what we will. It can be an opportunity to hollow out, to become a deeper human being, to become a more empathetic human being. One of the books that I really gained a lot of joy from, quiet joy, when I was grieving was called Broken Open, and I recommend it. And one of the things that author said was, when you experience grief, you can either break apart, and some people do. It's not true that everybody is made stronger by these kinds of tests. That's not true. But it is true that you can keep being presented with a choice to be less broken apart, or not broken apart, but broken open. And that is a bittersweet but very growthful kind of being broken. And I'm going to read you a poem about that before we're finished. So I think it's okay to laugh also while you're grieving. I know I did a lot of laughing at myself when I was circling the drain. Grief brain. We've heard of, pregnancy brain and chemo brain. Well, grief brain is a very real thing. And I'm actually sending you out like missionaries after these 2 talks to teach other people about grief brain. And that even though most businesses allow, 3 days for a death in the family, there's hardly a person alive who's ready to get back up to speed or go back to work after only 3 days. I mean, they might be there, but the grief brain makes a big difference in how well we can function for a while till we learn how to carry this thing. So, we would like grief to work in a very linear way, a straight line from point A to point B. But the second drawing is actually a much better image for how grief works. And I want you to memorize this image so that you could sketch it for somebody else that you may share with about grief, because we have this notion in the United States that has in other countries too, that has not been helpful, that you move through grief in a linear stages kind of way. And all the recent research says that is not the case. And the difficulty of this, of course, is that it makes us impatient with our own grief. So we add insult to injury. We not only are miserable or brokenhearted, but we're also beating ourselves up saying, how come I'm not getting over this sooner? Or yesterday I had a pretty good day and I was able to get things done and think more clearly. And now today, it's just the opposite. And that can make us impatient with ourselves at a time when we should really be learning how to practice better self-compassion. Now, one reason for this impatience, which I adore this little guy, I identify with him, is because we don't have many customs of mourning anymore. And not that long ago, even just 100 years ago, when someone had a death in the family, they would hang black crepe or a wreath on the door. They would wear a black armband. Women would often dress in black for at least 6 months to show they were in mourning. And then after 6 months, they would go to half mourning, which was gray or lilac. And so just by meeting someone new, they knew that you had had a loss. And part of the reason for all that was to cut the person some slack, to recognize that you may invite them for tea and they accept gratefully. And then on the day they're supposed to show up for tea, they just can't do it because they're too sad. We don't have any significations like that anymore. And so there's a lot of kind of faking it, people suffering very silently and privately because others are impatient with their grief, and maybe they are impatient with their own grief. So part of my message today is that you can't do everything. When you're at your best, you can't do everything. And when you're grieving, a significant, slice of your energy pie is taken up doing the work of grief. Work of grief isn't even a phrase that most people that you might be in ministry with, if you are a Stevens minister, or if you do pastoral ministry, if you're in healthcare, if you're a chaplain, if you're clergy. I mean, everyone's welcome. You may not fall into any of those categories, but if you do, you know that when you talk to people about the work of grief, a lot of times they don't even know what you mean. So one of the first poems in the book, which I really love and which helped me a lot myself, is called Grief Comes with a Ladder. And the gist of that poem is captured in a couple lines. Grief comes with a ladder, though not for ascending. The point of the poet, who has suffered losses of his own, is that you have to go down before you're willing to go up. And this actually squares very well with the research of a very popular figure now, who, if you don't know her work, I commend it to you. Brené Brown, B-R-E-N-E is her first name, Brown like the color. And Brené Brown is, she's written several marvelous books, and she's all over YouTube. And her Facebook page is very worth following. And she is a researcher on vulnerability, first and foremost, and then eventually her research expanded to related topics related to vulnerability. But the gist of what she found was that people who cut themselves off from being vulnerable, so the more challenging, maybe we would think of as the lower feelings, because they're not exactly what you get up in the morning hoping for. I don't think anybody leaps out of bed saying, boy, I hope something really bad happens today so I have a chance to be vulnerable and learn all kinds of lessons and model spiritual maturity for others. I don't think any of you are saying that. And I don't think Brené Brown is saying that either. But if you live long enough, those opportunities are going to come. But if you cut yourself off from that, she says you also have a tendency to cut yourself off from the more joyful, exuberant feelings that are on the other end of the range. So one of the poems in the book talks about how the speaker in the poem is saying, grief, I know you've been living under my porch and you want to come in and be my own dog. But I kept you outside, living under the porch because I didn't want to lay claim to you as my own dog. But by the end of the poem, the poet has realized that I need to name you as mine, or I won't ever come to grips with this thing that has happened to me. So this all sounds great. And if we were all possessed of a Buddha-like calm, we would be getting A+ for doing our grief work. But as much as I love this statue who remains extremely calm despite a missing nose and cracks, I'm really more like the monkey who's sitting on his shoulder, telling myself I have a Buddha-like calm and occasionally having it. I'm a Christian, I'm not a Buddhist, but I admire some of the teachings of on calm and acceptance that our Buddhist brothers and sisters have shared with us. And so here's another opportunity to laugh at ourselves. One day you're maybe writing in your journal, you're bringing your grief to prayer, you're doing small things that honor the person you've lost. And then the next day you're just mad, you're just in a bad mood, or you're just, you don't want to do any grief work. You just want to get on a boat to the islands, and that's normal. That's normal. So while we don't want to stay stuck in our grief to the point where it's debilitating, I think, like one of the women I worked with said she went to a grief group after she lost her partner, and she one day went home from the grief group and threw open her back door and said, "Come in, grief, I'm ready for you." And what a symbolic action. What a beautiful way to show that she was going to stop stuffing it and move into it. And this is only going to become increasingly important for us to understand as individuals and as a culture. because even before these tremendous losses we've suffered with the pandemic and the projected losses, which are horrific, we were already experiencing, I am part of it, the graying of America. Over 77 million baby boomers, and 8,000 to 10,000 a day are turning 65. And 65 is still young. I still consider myself in late middle age. But we do know that, no one is immortal, and health tends to decline for most or many after 65. We hope we're not among them, but it happens. And so we know that a lot of families are going to experience loss in the next 10 years. This is one of the things I've been trying to say to corporate America. Healthcare already knows this. They're trying to prepare for the growing number of aged, but businesses don't get it. Most businesses, I shouldn't say that. That's too painting everybody with the same broad brush, but some businesses don't get it. They don't have any grief support programs in place. They have all kinds of employee wellness programs in place, yoga and guided imagery and journaling classes and, wonderful things, but rarely is grief acknowledged in the workplace. And so here we have all these millennials who are no longer the youngins that we maybe once thought of them. The leading edge of the millennials is about 40 now. So these are folks with their own children and in the middle of their careers. And they are very quickly becoming a new sandwich generation. And in many ways, they have it even more challenging than I did, because I had my children younger than a lot of millennials do. And so at least my children were raised by the time I had to enter into care for my parents as they became more frail. But millennials who've often had their kids a little later are still actively raising kids and taking care of elders at the same time. It's even impacting them financially. It's just something for all of us who are sensitive to the trials of others to be aware of. A significant percentage of millennials are spending part of their salary on elder care already while they're still raising kids. So I think I won't want to be I don't want to be depressing by any stretch here, but I'm very strongly convinced, and I bet you are too, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, that to comfort the mourning is a mandate of the church. It's not optional. It's an important part of the mission that churches have been entrusted with. And I think it's time to up our game. And that's one of the reasons that I'm going to speak on Thursday about ways in which to use my book or poems that you find on your own, not here to sell books, in the ministry, which is only going to enlarge. All right, quick change now. How many of you could name most of the 5 stages of grief? I don't know if our platform allows you to raise your hand, but if it doesn't, just think like the 5 stages of grief. I'm sure I've heard them. Pretty sure I got a couple of them. If we were together live, I would let you grab a partner and try to come up with the 5 between the 2 of you, because, 2 heads are better than 1. So here's the thing. That was a trick question. And some of you know why. It's because although the 5 stages have become very widely known, in fact, it's one of the most widely known things to know about grief, and they came to us from a marvelous researcher, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And in no way is what I'm going to say meant to take anything away from her research, because it was a big leap forward in understanding. But Kubler-Ross meant her 5 stages to be applied to the dying, not the grieving. And she said that herself. She also said many times before she passed away that her stages should not be taken as entirely linear, moving through them in order to get from point A to point B. She understood the, messiness, the up and down, the roller coaster of accepting death and accepting grief. But as will often happen, the idea caught on and took on a life of its own. And despite her saying that it was never meant for the grieving, people now in popular culture apply it to grieving. Now, grief therapists And grief researchers, part of their job is to further educate us, as I'm no researcher, I learned from other geniuses, to educate us that this is actually doing more harm than good. So if you need a refresher, the stages of dying, articulated by Kubler-Ross, were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And the goal was for the dying person to actually come to acceptance eventually and be peaceful. And if you have any experience working with the dying, you know that doesn't even happen. People don't always move through or among the 5 stages. Not every death is a beautiful death. Some people go out with no acceptance, kicking and screaming, angry to the end, and so on. I think her goals to help people come to peace by the end were noble. I think we all want that for the dying. But for our purposes today, I want you to be aware that a marvelous writer, and you might want to look him up on YouTube or read some of his short articles. And he has a wonderful book too called Getting Grief Right. Patrick O'Malley, he's highly respected. He's a grief counselor for a zillion years, and he talks about the cages of the stages. It's such a useful concept. I invite you to borrow it if you do work with the grieving. And the problem with the idea of stages or closure is that it sets people up for the expectation of grief being resolved. Like, okay, I'm done grieving now. And then people are shocked when 10 years after the loss, when they've been functioning very well and they feel like they've learned to carry it, they get wiped out one day by something unexpected, like the death of a pet. Their beloved dog dies and they're grieving their husband all over again. Or one grief counselor that I did a webinar with in April said that her son had died over 20 years before the present. And when the pandemic came, she found herself grieving him all over again. She said it was kind of a setback. She said, now I know enough to know that that's normal and that grief goes like this, and I know I'm going to be okay. But I absolutely felt it more painfully again until I had made more of an adjustment to this new way of life, that we're living since the pandemic. So back to Patrick O'Malley, who says that when he first started counseling grievers, he said they would come into the first session and very appropriately would tell him stories about how sad they were and how much they missed their loved one, and tell them funny stories about the things they had loved the most about the person they lost. And he said now people come into the first session and they might talk about how sad they are, but they almost all say, I came to you because I don't know if I'm doing this right. It seems like it's taking a long time. My friends are telling me to move on. My friends are telling me to get back out there and date again, or whatever advice, that's not particularly welcome is coming their way. And I don't want to. Is there something wrong with me? This just adds a burden to what's already burdensome, the loss of the loved one. So he's, of course, given this a lot of thought, as you can imagine. And part of his message is that finding and sharing our stories of loss might be the most important task for grievers. And that's an important word, task. That grieving has tasks associated with it is much more useful and flexible model than the idea that grief has stages associated with it. Now, fortunately, enough people know this that they're starting to joke about the 5 stages of grief. So this is an actual greeting card that somebody shared with me that allows us to kind of make fun or extract ourselves from this notion of the 5 stages. And so this greeting card describes the 5 stages as crying in public, crying in the car, crying alone while watching TV, crying at work, and crying when you're a little drunk. And then the person who sends the card ends that with, I love you. And inside the card says something like, don't worry about the stages, I'm here with you, however long it takes, and that's really what grievers need to hear. So we're starting to become aware with, the springing up just in the last maybe 10 to 20 years of wonderful organizations like the Death Cafe, which is actually an organization where people are invited for a burger and a discussion about death. They talk about their own deaths, and they talk about how our national attitude toward death, that it's an enemy, that it's something to fight. I mean, we even see in obituaries, and if this was in an obituary you did, I don't criticize this. We're all doing the best we can, okay? But often in obituaries, you'll see something like so-and-so lost their battle with cancer, and went home to God on such and such a date. And that language is not helpful for the grievers, because everyone dies eventually. And using language like lost their battle makes it sound as if they fought a battle that was winnable. And ultimately, the battle, which is not actually that useful a frame, is never winnable, because we're all going to shuffle off this mortal coil. So I don't own stock in this company or anything. I don't promote this line of cards. I just use them as a teachable moment to show that there are definitely better and worse ways to respond to people's pain, and that I am sending you out like missionaries to start conversations with people. If you're grieving yourself, don't be afraid to say gently, because I think most people mean the best, even when they say something not helpful. They didn't mean to be not helpful, but we can gently educate them. Like, here's what would really help me. Can you just say my loved one's name sometimes? Can you just be comfortable letting me tell some stories about him or her? That's what really helps me in my grief, or just sitting with me, or just watching a movie with me. I don't need to be talked out of my grief. I need to be accompanied in my grief. And that's why the people who have this card line also wrote a book called There Is No Good Card for This: What to Say and Do When Life is Scary, Awful, and Unfair to People You Love. And this is actually written for the people who are supporting grievers, or supporting people who've had a tragic accident, or become quadriplegics, or had a big change in life, lost their business or whatever. It's a terrific little book. So I'll just call attention to two other cards, the ones on either side of the middle. On the left, one that I really love. In Japan, broken objects are often repaired with gold. The flaw is seen as a unique piece of the object's history, which adds to its beauty. Consider this when you feel broken. I'm telling you, I didn't get this card when I was grieving, but if I had, I think it would have been among my favorites, because after I stopped circling the drain and I was putting myself back together in the new normal that was parentless after a month, I started to see my grief as something that I could make into a gift. I wasn't ready at the beginning to make it into a gift. I was heartbroken, but something that could become a place of connection with other people who suffered a loss. I can connect with grievers now in a way I never could before that loss. I had a miscarriage early in my marriage, and it was horrible. It was horrible. And it took me a long time to come to terms with it. But once I did kind of come to terms with it, anytime somebody confided in me that they had a miscarriage, man, I was right there. I knew exactly how they felt. I wouldn't say that. It's never appropriate to say, I know exactly how you feel, because you don't know exactly how somebody feels. But I had a pretty good inkling, and a way better indication than I did before I'd suffered that loss myself. So what I really encourage us all to do is be able to laugh at ourselves when we do goofy things because of grief. Be able to laugh and like a bittersweet laugh at how painful it is when other people say things, that aren't helpful, and to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem, in that we, are willing to offer comforts that are true comforts. All right, so if you have questions or comments or yeah buts, I'm happy to see them or take them at the end. This one's a little angrier than I would ever be, but I'll bet a few of us have felt this way. So I conclude with that. All right, so back to these tasks of mourning. Worden, a researcher named Worden, whose work you might want to peek into as well, has described 4 tasks of mourning. And I think this is much more useful to us as grievers and to people we minister to than stages. And look at these tasks. And as I go through them, I invite you to take a thoughtful moment to think, like, how many of these tasks have I been engaged in? They're not linear. It's not like you do this one first and you do this one second. They jump around, you know. But Worden says working on all 4 of these tasks seems to be the key to peace. So the first one is just accepting the reality of the loss. That is a huge task. I know when my parents passed, we had a trip planned. It was summertime, so we had a vacation planned. And it wasn't that long after my parents died that we left on this vacation, which had been, of course, all paid for and all so on. I'm sorry, I turned that off and it's still... You guys are getting the full treatment here today. Bless you. So I go into a gift shop while we're on vacation, and I walk up to the postcards and I'm standing there selecting one for my parents because that was one of our customs. Anytime either of us went on a trip, we always sent a postcard. And then I realized there's nobody to send a postcard to. I mean, I had to leave. I was like, some people call that a grief quake. And I was just wiped out for a couple of minutes, like, holy moly, how could I have forgotten? But for a moment, I did. People tell me this happens to them when they wake up in the morning. They have to remember all over again. And it's terrible. The second task is to process the pain. So this is the grief comes with a ladder, that though not for ascending, that you descend and you throw open your doors and you become willing. You may not be at first, but you become willing to process the pain of the grief. And if you have a mature spirituality, you may even find, or who has a mature spirituality? We're all pursuing a more mature spirituality, right? But you may even allow it to hollow you out. So I did a lot of not great things when I was grieving. Like, I was cranky sometimes with the people that loved me the most. I didn't always practice gratitude to the extent that I had before I was grieving. You know, we all make mistakes. But I did often find my prayer moving in the direction of all those around the world who were accompanying the dying at this moment, or all those who were grieving just like I was. And it did open my heart in a new way, because this is one of the universal human experiences. And the third task is to slowly adjust to a world without the deceased. And that can happen in all kinds of ways and take as long as it takes. And then the fourth task, and this is one I think is underemphasized, and that's why I'm so happy to be able to speak with you today and Wednesday, is to find an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. And most people, friends and family, may understand a connection that happens around the time of the death. So I think it's lovely that a lot of people will plant a tree in a loved one's memory, or dedicate a bench in the park in their memory, or set a place at the table for them the first Thanksgiving or Christmas that they're not with you. You know, those are not morbid customs in my view. Those are healthy ways to find enduring connections. And it's also okay to have those enduring connections last a lifetime. So you may want to begin prayers of the gathered family. I know my husband's family did this. He had a brother who died suddenly from an aneurysm when he was only in his 40s. And his parents were 100% German, and the Christmas tree and an elaborate display with trains and buildings and everything was a big part of their heritage. And so every year they would have a little prayer around the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, and then turn the lights on for the first time. And they always remembered my brother-in-law, Joe, very briefly, but they always remembered him in that prayer. And they would allude to the family gathered here. and the family who has gone before. And that was important. That was a beautiful example of an enduring connection for them. So why poetry? I'll say more about this on Wednesday, but I'm going to invite you, if you're a person who has thought, I don't get poetry, or I don't like poetry, poetry makes me feel stupid. That is a common feeling. So you're in good company. And I'm just going to ask you to set that feeling to one side. Don't abandon it. Just hold it as a hypothesis, while I try to talk about why I believe poetry is really a powerful healing tool. And for those of you who do ministry, an essential, strong tool in your toolkit that is not yet as widely accepted as music therapy or art therapy, for example, where we've really come to understand that those are important parts of helping people, but poetry not as much yet. Although there is a whole National Society of Poetry Therapists in the United States, and healing arts departments in hospitals and hospices are using it more. I'm not sure it's something that a lot of us regular folks are using in spiritual direction or when we accompany someone who's grieving. And yet you don't have to be a scholar to do it. In fact, I think Mary Oliver, a prize-winning American poet who just died a few years ago, really nailed it when she said, how people come from delight or the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. Think about it. When do people want to read a poem? It's usually a significant event, a wedding, a baptism, a funeral. There's something in the human brain, I dare to say, that is kind of wired toward wanting the right words to commemorate a significant event. And not every poem is right, of course. And there is some poetry out there written about death that actually isn't all that helpful. It's more in the vein of, God needed another angel, which, as I've already shared, I think can do. If that comforts you, I'm happy for you. And I mean that truly. All right. But I've met so many people who become very allergic to that, to God, to that notion of God as somebody who willy-nilly, takes people from you. That does not comfort me, and I don't use it myself. So I would avoid poetry of that kind. I think what I tried to do, and I had two wonderful women, Virginia Douglas and Molly Bolton. Virginia's a retired social worker who's certified in the sacred art of living and dying, or she holds a certificate. And Molly Bolton is, until very recently, a chaplain in the Cleveland Clinic. She just moved. But those two women met with me for over a year. They're both poetry lovers. Molly is using poetry in her chaplaincy in fantastic ways, which I am going to share with you next Wednesday and tell stories about. So I hope you'll come back for that, because it's really, her experiences are very interesting. And we read about 1,000 poems before we picked the 70 that are in this book. Now, that doesn't make us anything special. It just makes us sensitive, as you are, to the needs of grievers, and able to look at a poem and say, this does not exactly have the right stuff. This tells too much. This doesn't raise questions. It doesn't offer comfort in the way we think it should. And it doesn't acknowledge that grief can be excruciating and take a while. So that's why I put in this quote, which I love and which I often share when I do spiritual direction. Feeling lost, crazy, and desperate belongs to a good life as much as optimism, certainty, and reason. This is what I think we have a tendency to overlook. I'm all for positive psychology. I think it's a marvelous innovation in psychological research in the last 40 years. And I teach classes myself on the science of happiness and the science of optimism that teach us how to make active in our lives the findings of positive psychology. And I also think that people can take positivity to an almost toxic level, so that anything that smacks of grief or desperation or vulnerability is shunted to the side. How quickly can we get through that so we can get back to the good stuff, feeling happy? And that's not really how life is. That's not even how the life of Jesus unfolded. It's not the way the life of the saints unfolded. They all had times, I'm sure, when they felt lost, crazy, and desperate. And they often left us records of that in their own lives. It's one of the reasons we admire them, because they lived through those days and got to other days and instructed us by their witness. So I want to offer a model for understanding grief that's so easily reproducible that if you have a pen and paper near you, you can sketch this out for yourself and then be prepared to share it with others, going forward. And this was shared on Twitter by a woman named Lauren Herschel, who was grieving and who went to a doctor's appointment and shared with her physician that she really felt sometimes like she was losing it since she had suffered this loss. And the doctor took out a sketch pad and a pen and sketched this for her. And it helped her so much that she shared it on Twitter, and it quickly went viral onto Facebook and all kinds of other platforms because it really resonates with people. And that's why I want to share it with you. Right? It's not copyrighted or anything. She's put it out there for the good of the world, and I believe it to be in the public domain. So I'm sharing it, and you can too. So the model is called the ball in the box. And the physician sketched a box, and inside the box is a pain button on the left, and then the ball is the grief, the loss, the whatever the tragedy is. And he pointed out that in the beginning, the ball is huge, and you can't move the box around without the ball hitting the pain button. So, every hour of every day at the beginning, the griever is hitting the pain button over and over again. Bing, bing, bing. It rattles around on its own in there. You can't control it. It just keeps hurting, and sometimes it seems unrelenting. And if you are at that stage in a loss now, I want to offer you the hope that the ball won't always be as big as it is now. On the other hand, there is nothing wrong with the ball being as big as it is now. That is normal. It's part of the tasks of mourning to feel it very deeply, even cruelly at the beginning. But over time, unless the person is stuck in their grief, and that's something we'll talk about next time, the ball does get smaller. It hits the button less and less often, but when it does, it hurts just as much. That's part of why I think the concept of a grief quake is useful, because people can go for weeks or months and be functioning pretty well, and then something hits that pain button head on, and it's a big grief quake. And sometimes people want to fight that, like, what's wrong with me? I thought I was doing better. Listen to the judgment in that of ourselves. How wonderful it would be if someone coached us to say, that just is what it is. This is part of grief. Grief quakes are normal, and that we would accept them and treat ourselves with compassion instead of fighting them. It's better. You feel better often because you can function day to day more easily. But the downside is that the ball randomly hits the button when you least expect it. For most people, the ball never really goes away. That doesn't mean they're not resilient. That doesn't mean they'll never be happy again. There are some people who think it's disloyal to be happy again after a loss. I knew one woman whose grandmother had suffered a loss when she was just a young woman. Her husband went to work one day and he never came home. And they didn't know if he abandoned the family or, fell into the river or was killed. They never found out what happened to him. And the sad thing, there's so many sad things about that. She went on to raise her kids by herself. She never remarried. But her way of coping or not coping with that horrible loss, a kind of loss we call an ambiguous loss, which is especially challenging, and which I'll talk about more on Wednesday, was to say often, I'll never get over it. I'll never get over it. And it was such a self-fulfilling prophecy that by the time my friend told me the story about her grandma was in her 90s. And the story of the loss of her husband was still one of the first stories she would tell about herself when she met somebody new. So you know how when you meet somebody new and you start talking about like who you are and what you've done and so on, that was the story that she made, paramount in her life. And my friend said she always ends it the same way, and I never got over it. And she never did. Well, just think of all the pain embodied in that. The idea that grief is something you get over instead of learning to carry. The idea clearly implicit that she was somehow disloyal if she would have ever, married again. I mean, we could talk about that for an hour, but I invite you to think about that if you ever fall into that kind of self-talk. A gentler self-talk serves us better. We might even quantify it by saying, today I feel like I'll never be the same. And maybe I won't ever be the same, but I will be happy again. A time can come. So to conclude, Lauren Herschel's physician said to her that it hits less and less. You have more time to recover between hits, and that is a grace, unlike when the ball was still giant, and that she thought this was the best description she'd heard in a long time. So some of you may want to comment in the chat box whether or not you find this a useful model or how you think you might use it, or ask questions about it, please. All right, so moving a little bit more, and I'm watching our time, we're doing well. I want to just emphasize this notion of grief brain that I mentioned before. It plagues many, if not most, grievers, both at home and at work. And one of the gifts that we can give to the grieving is to normalize this, that concentration suffers, that grief can have a physical component where the person feels achy or like they're getting a cold or tired a lot of the time. Some people actually have symptoms where their heart aches a little. There's research been done on people who wind up in the emergency room because they think they're having a heart attack, which is a good thing. If you think you're having a heart attack, you should go to the emergency room. But then when they run the tests that everything is normal, but they've recently suffered a grief and their heart is broken, So this is something you can read about if you want to look, Google grief brain, or Google, physical and mental effects of grief, I'm sorry. And a lot is written in very, easy to understand ways that was a comfort to me, that's for sure. And I think would be to you too. So I always invite people to consider hanging up a slogan like this in their kitchen where they'll see it every day, because I think it's very true. When you're grieving, so little can feel under control. And grief counselors often say to people, just pick 1 to 3 things that you want to accomplish every day. And that thing might be, getting up and going to work and getting home. Or that thing might be, I made myself 2 nutritious meals today. Because just doing the work of grief and feeling so discombobulated by it takes a lot of energy, and it's okay to ask for help. I think it's an honor to be asked for help by a grieving person. And you can, if you have trouble asking for help and you do it, remind the person who's helping you that, you consider yourself in their debt and that you would be happy to reciprocate sometime, or make a list of who helped you. And then 2 years from now, when you're feeling more like yourself again, drop a pie off at their house, but don't hesitate to ask for help when you're in the thick of it, because everybody needs that. And in the olden days, when we had more mourning customs that were robust and more mourning rituals than we have in American culture now, people got more help than they get now. So if this feels hard, it's because it is. All right. It's okay to laugh at yourself sometimes, just like it is to cry. So are there any thoughts or questions? Is anything in any of the chat boxes on the platforms we're on yet, gentlemen?
Kim, I'm not seeing any comments coming up. I know there's folks with us, folks watching. David, you seeing anything?
Not in the Q&A, but I think if anything, they're on Facebook.
Right, and I'm not seeing comments on Facebook, but I will invite them. The other thing
Yes.
that we have to be aware of is that there's a delay in terms of Facebook by a couple of minutes. So when we're asking for questions, we won't have them come up right away typically.
I will
So-
definitely ask again then.
Okay, I'll keep an eye here.
Thank you, Charlie. If
Sure.
there's something that people have been wanting to put in the chat box, do it now or in the next couple minutes while I'm talking.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think this is so relevant to the current pandemic because being out of control or not feeling like you have control has just been rampant in all of our lives since March.
So
And
true.
I know in one day, or I should say 1 week at the church I'm involved in, we made decisions, 3 different, first we weren't going to have coffee hour after church, then we weren't going to pass the peace during church, then we weren't going to have church, and
Wow.
all that happened in 1 week. And,
Right.
and then people, when they found out they weren't going to be able to get a haircut or get their hair done
Right.
for an
Little things.
indeterminate amount of time. I mean, that's just,
Right.
it's just huge in terms of your daily life.
It
So I think
is.
all this is extremely relevant, not just for people that are dealing with major loss, of course, but people that are just dealing with daily life right now. So,
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that. I know one of my biggest, trials to bear right now is I can't see my kids as often as I want to.
right.
And I'm sure many of us are in that boat.
People come to Lakeside for family reunions and rent a couple cottages, and there's 17 people in one and 10 in the other, and a lot of that's not happening this year. And young people aren't seeing older people, and one side of the family is not seeing the other, and for all good and legitimate reasons in terms of safety and health. But it's a very different world all of a sudden.
It is, and it's painful. And, already as a society, we don't live like a village,
Right.
So loneliness was already, I've seen articles calling it an epidemic in the United States.
Yeah.
So, part of our opportunity in the next months is to make sure we get on Zoom with people or drop them old-fashioned notes or letters or, because it's hard. It's just hard. No matter how much you practice gratitude, which I have a robust gratitude practice, and I am grateful, I can still get pretty bummed when I know I'm not going to see, my kids. So, all right, well, let's move on.
Go ahead.
Did you want to say anything else, Charlie? Okay. All right.
I'm good.
All right. Thank you. So, Maurice Riordan said very succinctly that one of the things that poetry does is open the doors of perception, or another way of putting it, it increases our stock of available reality. I love that phrase. Enlarging our capacity. I love that phrase, to understand and take in things. I believe that with every fiber of my being. If I didn't, I would have given up. But with the companions that supported me during the writing of the book and my own experience of how, my parents were already frail and I was already needing to take care of them to a degree when I started the book. And then, of course, they passed away right around the time I was submitting the manuscript. Over and over, these poems that we chose, I found increased my stock of available reality and enlarged my capacity. And even though I said early on that your loss is not a gift, it's not a test, it's not a lesson, it does, grief and poetry both give us that opportunity, if we take it, to enlarge our capacity. And I do think that is deep and important spiritual work. And if we look at, our own Christian witness, and we look at the religious traditions, the wisdom traditions around the world, you could summarize almost all of them by saying that they seek to enlarge the capacity for love and peace and mutual understanding of those whose lives they touch. So when we laid the book out, we did it in 4 arcs. And we did it to try to emphasize that we can be resilient and still do the work of mourning. We can choose not to be in denial, not to be death averse, which is, something our culture's been called, but to become resilient for doing the work and the tasks of grief. And there's a bunch of evidence, research that I would like to see, more widely disseminated, that things like journal writing, naming feelings and telling stories, adopting or expanding our mindfulness practices when we're grieving or working with grievers, walking and being out in nature in a mindful way, which some people are calling nature therapy, and healthy self-care practices are all elements in the total pie of doing, they're all pieces of the pie in doing the work of grief. And you may wonder, well, why would you start the first section of your book with dusk and twilight, facing mortality, a diagnosis, anticipatory grief, or caregiving and the long goodbye that so many people experience when they're losing someone to dementia or Parkinson's? Well, it's because we know now from the research that grief starts often well before the death. Now, if the death is a sudden loss or a violent death, that's really, every loss is horrible. There would maybe not be that anticipatory grief, but the majority of us suffer losses due to illness or old age or, addiction and so on. And those griefs are anticipatory. This can't end well. And they last for a long time before the actual death can happen. So I'm sending you out like missionaries to share that too. If anticipatory grief is a new idea to you, tuck that away in your toolkit, because when I work with people and I tell them, well, I interviewed dozens and dozens of people, both grievers and people who work with grievers while I was doing the book. And some of the grievers had never heard of anticipatory grief. And when you tell them what it is, just introduce it as a concept, they kind of light up. You can see that it helps take away some of their burden, because they've been beating themselves up because they're sad and the person is still there. But I know from experience with dementia that the person is still there physically, but they are not, in many ways, the person that you knew. And that's very sad. Then the second arc is the sunset, the death of the actual death and the funeral. And then the deaths of family, partner, spouse, untimely death. So reflections on the loss in the weeks that follow and months that follow the loss is arc 3. And then the last arc is starlight to dawn. The sun comes up again. Most of us do learn how to carry this. Most of us don't waste our pain. We become wiser because of our pain. And we learn to be grateful and happy and love in a new way and again. So you notice also that each of the 4 arcs has mindfulness activities, and those are for people who don't only love words, they love actions. And the reflections that follow each poem, this is not just a book of poetry. This is really a companion on your grief journey. So there's a poem, but then there's a reflection that I wrote and that a bunch of beta readers really read and improved. And this group was very open source. There's a lot of people's wisdom in this book, and I'm proud and delighted by that. There's a reflection with a couple reflection questions, but the poems were all chosen to be accessible, to be understandable. They're not sing-song. They don't sound like greeting cards, but they are mostly contemporary poetry that are pretty easy to discuss and reflect on, and that most people find are a powerful springboard for either prayer or meditation or journal writing. And then the mindfulness activities at the end of each section give you ideas for ways to memorialize your loved one, to build that enduring connection that Worden talks about as the 4th task of mourning, and so on. And I'm really proud that the book was reviewed by people who are offering spiritual care, clergy, chaplains, social workers, all contributed to the book, and some reviewed it. So what is mindful reading? Well, there's different ways to do it. Some of you will have heard of or done Lectio Divina, and that's just Latin for, the divine word. And to do this Lectio Divina, a Latin phrase, scares some people off, so I always refer to it as mindful reading. But if you know about Lectio, you already know this process. So if you're using this for yourself as a griever, or you're going to share it with a family member or somebody you're in ministry with, it's helpful to have a copy of the poem, in front of you on paper. Some people want to underline and mark it up and write questions in the margin. That's great. And then I recommend, and I learned this from people more expert than myself, that it's a good idea to read the poem out loud, even if you're by yourself. For most of the history of the world, poetry was understood as an art that comes off your lips and falls on your ears. It's only in very recent years that people are imagining themselves or others reading poetry in an armchair under a lamp alone. For most of the history of the world, poetry was a communal activity. My husband's family, who I mentioned to you before, he had uncles who would memorize long, pages long story poems like Dangerous Dan McGrew and The Face on the Barroom Floor and so on. And they would stand and recite these poems as entertainment for the extended family at gatherings. And then poems were often used at funerals and so on. And people would write poems to their friends when they were moving to another city. Poetry was more widely embraced by every man and every woman than maybe now, although we are seeing a huge resurgence in poetry that, as you can imagine, gladdens my heart. So read the poem aloud so that you hear it as well as see it. Then take a little pause, choose a word or phrase that draws you or that moves you, or sometimes it's what repels you. Sometimes the energy is in the part of the poem that you resist. And it can be more than one word. It can be a phrase. It can be a whole line. It can be 2 lines. And then after having that quiet experience, if you're with another person doing ministry, you might explore how that describes your experience. So usually when I do a poetry circle, which I hope some of you, we're doing virtual poetry circles now. So if you want to be part of one of them, email me and I'll put you on the list. And when we do that, I usually just say, after we've had these periods of silence and then shared our word or phrase, so what do you think? And the discussion is always rich, because one of the things poems do is work a little miracle or create a kind of alchemy where it helps you to get beyond, superficial conversation into something that matters. And that's one of the reasons people love coming to poetry circles or using them in chaplaincy, for example, because it cuts through a lot of the garbage. I can't tell you how many notes I've had from people after being at a workshop like this and saying to me, the person has seen me so many times and they know me well, it's hard to get them past chit chat right now. But I took one of your poems with me and I used that after we were a couple of minutes into our visit, and it just opened it right up. That's why we did what we did. All right. So when we do mindful reading, we're helping people to increase robust resilience skills, or we're doing it for ourselves. And not only for that anticipatory grief that comes with caregiving, but also with disenfranchised grief and complicated grief, which I'm going to say just a few words about. So if you want to know more about disenfranchised grief, if this is a new concept, the go-to guy is Ken Doka, a grief researcher who's made this his specialty. And he's easy to understand. He's written lots of articles for us regular folks. You don't have to be an academic to embrace this. But his definition is the grief that persons experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. So these kinds of griefs could be, a very common one actually is the death of a pet. When you lose a pet, the research shows, depending on your circumstances, you may grieve as much as you grieve the loss of a human. But at least in our culture, that's not very well understood. So while some people will send you a card or offer to sit with you or send over a meal when you lose a beloved pet, it's not uncommon to get a response like, it was just a cat, or it was just a dog. So people are made to feel shame. Their grief is disenfranchised by others because others may consider it a small grief or an unworthy grief. This happens often in the LGBTQ culture, where a couple may be deeply committed to one another, but they never married, for example, and they don't have a legal standing relationship. And so they don't feel like they can publicly mourn, or where a family of origin cuts a partner out of the mourning because they didn't approve of that spouse or partner, or their religions are different, or it can happen for so many reasons. Another example is we have a growing body of research that shows that people do in fact mourn ex-husbands and wives. They do in fact mourn miscarried babies, even though it may have been 40 years ago and everybody said, oh, you'll have another baby. And so they just shut down their mourning because it was disenfranchised at that time. Now I think people are more aware, that those losses are real losses. How do you tell somebody, though, that you're sad today because your ex-husband died? A lot of people don't want to hear that, or they think that the divorce was a cause for celebration. Well, maybe the divorce was inevitable or the right thing to do. And could have been domestic violence. There could have been addiction. Who knows what was the straw that broke the camel's back? But for most marriages, there were some good years. And when the person dies, you mourn those. So this notion of disenfranchised grief, if you can help acknowledge that in yourself or others, is really a gift, because it's very powerful, but a lot of people don't have words for it. And another kind of grief is simply called complicated grief. And complicated grief is the name that grief counselors give to those who are on a very long path. It usually means that the person has been grieving acutely for more than 2 years, and that they feel stuck, and that they have not been able to resume the activities of daily living to the degree they would like to. And so there's need for more professional help. So if you lead a grief group, or if you're clergy or Stevens minister, this is something to really keep a weather eye out for, because it takes some, savvy to recognize when a person just needs more time and when they truly are stuck or bitter or unable to carry the grief, and that's when I usually will make a referral. So everybody, in my view, all clergy, all chaplains, all Stevens ministers, all counselors, all spiritual directors should have a short list that includes a good grief counselor or two that they can refer to. And if you're doing spiritual direction, for example, you could keep seeing the person for spiritual direction while they see the grief counselor. But at a certain point, you maybe have to make a moral discernment that you can't see them for spiritual direction unless they see a grief counselor, because you've become an enabler. You don't mean to, you didn't want to, but the person has kind of pushed you into that role. And once we realize that, then ethically, of course, we need to make sure that we're not just the Band-Aid, and that the other person is getting the assistance that they need. So when feelings of loss are debilitating, notice how careful I'm trying to be in my language, and when they don't improve even after time passes, that's when you suspect complicated grief. That painful emotions are so long-lasting and so severe that the griever has trouble recovering from the loss and resuming their own life. So all those things that I hope you will learn more of, and I'm going to give you a couple places where you could easily learn more about those things. What are some practical strategies then that we as people in ministry or people who are grieving can find to increase resilience? First of all, when you're doing ministry, remember that you are doing ministry to both introverts and extroverts. So I know a lot of us have knowledge of good grief support groups near us, and we will refer people to those groups, and that's a good thing. But we also know that grief support groups are more likely to work for extroverts. Now, this does not mean life of the party. This is like the psychological meaning of extroverts. People who process information externally, they talk about it, rather than introverts who need some time to process information because their processing happens internally, and then and only then are they ready to talk about it. So this is not to say that introverts can't benefit from grief groups, but they may not benefit from a grief group at first. They might need 6 months. A lot of people actually need 6 months to mourn before they benefit from a group. There's research that shows that one of the mistakes we make is to refer people to a grief group too soon, and they're not ready for it, and then they drop out after the first or second. For the first 6 months, often the most useful intervention is working one-on-one with somebody, a grief counselor, a spiritual director, or a trusted friend who can just listen. And then a grief group is often more helpful when the person's life has settled down just a little bit. Because at first, people are so wrecked that they can hardly even take in what the grief group is trying to teach them, you know. So introverts, for example, may not want a grief group, and there has to be something else for them. So that's where I have tried to vet social media sites that are good, you know, where the people actually know what they're doing, the people who moderate it, and where you won't get any misinformation. So you can encourage people to participate in programs that address their issues. I think it's a good thing for people in ministry to have a short pile of various articles on the nature of grief and what is disenfranchised grief and what is complicated grief and what is anticipatory grief, to kind of send the person off with after a pastoral counseling session. Just educating people about what to expect, what's normal, what isn't, grief brain, and so on, is really important. And there's a lot of good news here. Work by a man named Gregory Bonanno, Bonano, Bonanno, has shown that people are more resilient than they think they are, and they're more resilient than we think they are a lot of times, and that it helps to tell them that. So treating people like a precious flower all the time actually can be bad for them. I'm not saying not to be empathetic. I'm not saying don't be compassionate. I'm not saying don't help them. I'm sure you know that. But I am saying letting people know that they may have untapped reserves, or that they're smart and they can read, or they can figure this out, or they'll know if and when they need more help. Those kinds of things are often helpful to say. And Bonanno has done research with really big things, like he's done research with people who had terrible ambiguous losses because half their family was swept away by a tsunami, you know. And what they found in their research, that was more helpful to emphasize how to become resilient than it was to emphasize, you know, oh, I'm so sorry, this was such a terrible tragedy. That can actually weaken some people if that's all they get. And then here are some of the social media resources that will help all of us, whether you're a griever or helping grievers. Option B, which has a strong social media presence and came out of the book titled Option B, written by a woman in her 40s who very sadly found her husband dead next to an exercise machine. He was her age too and had no warning, and they had 2 young children. And she wrote very transparently, and with the help of an expert in positive psychology, Option B. So that's a marvelous resource for all grievers, but especially younger grievers who are still working and raising kids and so on. And then a site that I've come to love, and I signed up to get their occasional emails, is called What's Your Grief? And they really know what they're talking about. They have an archive of articles that are so good that I often use them in the way I've described to you. You know, I have a little 2 copies of 5 or 10 of them that I think are terrific and that almost any griever can benefit from, and I send them home with that person. So you don't have to compose these articles. They're already out there, very well done and ready for you to use. And all you have to do is go to the What's Your Grief website and maybe both sign up for their email, which does not flood your inbox because it's occasional, or go through their archives and save some of their articles, which are consistently good. And then the last one is the Grief Anonymous group, and they're terrific. Holy cow. They have grown. I talked to them. They've just grown in leaps and bounds since they first established a social presence. And the Grief Anonymous group has multiple groups that they're moderating. So if you're grieving the death of a pet, they have a group just for that. If you had a child die, they have a group just for that. If you lost somebody in a violent crime, they have a group for that. If you lost somebody to opioids, they have a group for that. And you can join as many of those groups as fits your need. And that's not to say you won't occasionally get a comment that seems a little off the wall, but I've monitored these groups for the whole 4 years that I was working on the book. And 9 times out of 10, the advice or the reflection that people are offering when someone posts on Grief Anonymous pages is very sound. And it's being offered by people who've been through it, and they're just kind of farther along in their grief, or they read this or that book, or they're recommending this or that resource. It's just a wealth of stuff, all free, all at your fingertips. So I hope you wrote those down and you investigate some of those and share them with others. So I think I might stop here so that we have a little time for Q&A if we want. Yes. I want to end with Lori Duchesne's reassurance that it's oversimplified to say that happiness is a choice. It's true, but it's also oversimplified. It's more accurate to say happiness takes lots of choices that are sometimes hard to make, like the choice to accept ourselves and our struggles, the choice to take responsibility for getting help, and the choice to do the things that are good for us, even when, especially when, we feel like giving up. So what do we have, Charlie? Do you have any comments you'd like to add, or do we have questions?
Yes, there are some comments on Facebook. First of all, someone's asking, is this tape to watch later? A friend just lost her husband of 50 years. Would love to share this with her. Have been taking notes, but so many worthwhile things have been shared. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, the answer is yes. These are being taped and being archived on Facebook Live and on the Lakeside website. And I can't promise that 20 years from now they'll still be there, but at least in the near future, we have no plan to take them down. But they will be there for the next few months, certainly. Good. And then someone else said the ball in the box idea is very accurate, very helpful. Good. And then a comment that I will share from another person: the loss of a loved one always causes grief and will bring sadness. The key is to recognize that your life goes on, but is still filled with things to be grateful for. Yes. The loss will always be with you, but so will the good memories. Then it continues, but remember that we have incredible technology that lets us communicate with sight. So these are, I think these are
wonderful,
helpful things that folks are chiming in with, and know that you're making quite a difference at Lakeside this afternoon. Kim, I want to just in conclusion say, maybe you want to make comment on the comments,
Well, I think there's wisdom there, and exactly the kind of wisdom that just emerged in those comments. That's the kind of thing you'll find on these 3 sites that I'm recommending. Option B, What's Your Grief, and Grief Anonymous. And again, I have no stock in these groups, and most of these, it's a ministry for these people. Right. But they're good, you know. So if your heart lifted at all when you heard Charlie say that, yeah, I felt that too. That's what you can gain, you know. Well, I hope from my book and from those sites. And I put up the website that my ministry comes out of, which is loaded with archived mindfulness poems and articles that are all free to you. There are bookmarks there you can download for free and print and give to friends and grievers. So please visit that. And then here's my contact information if you would like it.
And the nice thing is a lot of people don't know where to turn, and this gives you some handles because I think many folks find themselves in a situation where we would like to be more helpful than we think we're able to be. And also one of the things that came a light bulb turned on for me was being so helpful of being able to share your story. And I had someone just recently that she seemed like they just wanted to share their story, and
Yes.
think about it being very therapeutic and very helpful.
Right.
Appreciate your bringing that out for us,
Well,
Kim.
oh yeah, just listening is everything.
I hope you'll all be back on Wednesday
Me
afternoon
too.
at 3 o'clock. That will be the live session when you can ask questions and make comments. Or, of course, these things will be taped and archived for later use. So if you're not able to be back Wednesday, please look up the archived material. And the easiest way, I think, is to go on the Lakeside website and then click on calendar. And then when it comes up 3 o'clock, Religious Life Seminar, click that, and then you have it in front of you. That's one easy way to do it for people that are wondering about sharing it with a friend. And most people can follow that sequence easily and get to the material. And then they'll also see what else Lakeside is offering at the same time. Well, Kim, thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlie. And may I quickly say that there will be new material presented on Wednesday. It will be Q&A, but there'll also be additional instruction that won't repeat what we did today. So if you're excited about poetry and grieving and a healing art, you'll get more.
Well, thank you. And I will say, and Kim didn't ask me to say this, but I want to, and that is that check out her book at the fine print bookstore if you're at Lakeside, or go online and order it, because it is a wealth. It is a companion, as it says, a companion on the journey. And the poetry is very helpful. When we did it at our church, folks found it very engaging and very helpful. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
God bless you all, and we'll see you on Wednesday. Bye now.
Bye.